Hello, this is the Delicious Legacy Podcast, and I'm your host, Thomas Dinas. Welcome back for another archaeogastronomical adventure. But before we start, have a listen to this.
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. My name's Dr Neil Buttery and I'm host of the British Food History Podcast, a podcast that you, as a fan of the Delicious Legacy, might be interested in. I explore British food and its history in all its glory, with interviews with special guests, recipes, reenactments, and tracking down forgotten recipes and hyper-regional specialities. Previous topics include medieval eels, 18th century dining, curry, London street food sellers, breakfast, and the good old Yorkshire pudding. Search for the British Food History Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And now, back to the Delicious Legacy. Cheers!
Since starting this podcast, over 2 years ago now, I've covered many topics from the ancient world. But I never ventured in great detail in India's past to examine her vast, rich cuisine and history into any detail. Of course, we've seen and we know the ancient Greeks and Romans had trade networks inland and on sea that stretched to the Indian subcontinent. And there was a complex and interconnected commerce of spices, of many expensive ingredients used in the ancient Greek and Roman cuisine, chiefly amongst them pepper, black and long pepper, but also cinnamon and ginger and various others. Some of the world's earliest civilizations rose and fell in the Indian subcontinent long before the Greeks wrote and spread their Homeric epics. But what do we know of the Indian culinary history? What do we know of their foods and ancient recipes? Did the complex mix of religions over the millennia, and especially with Hinduism and later Buddhism, played a significant role in the diet of the people? Have many things survived? What's the lineage that connects the past inhabitants of this vast land to the present day? Many of our staples today and some of the most popular vegetables and fruits have their origins in India. Take cucumbers and aubergines for example, and also mangoes. Sugar from sugarcane first is mentioned in ancient India around 1000 BCE, as we've seen in the episode of the podcast with Dr Neil Buttery a couple of months ago. For those of us in London, and of course the countless hordes of tourists that they descend down on London's East End, when we think of Indian food, our mind first comes to the curry houses of Brick Lane. Of course, there used to be a lot more Indian restaurants on that street, on Brick Lane, but nowadays it's a mixture of all sorts of different things. But going back to the early history after World War II, that area was full of what we call curry houses, Indian food restaurants, which served the food that it was very new and exciting to most British people by then. And rightly or wrongly, we associate Indian food with that very specific thing, curry houses, curry restaurants. But who knows that this particular type of food was kind of mixture and an interpretation of what the Anglo-Indians ate in India, but interpreted through the eyes of Bangladeshi seamen who settled in London's East End. Anyway, that's one fascinating aspect of the history of Indian food, which we are going to explore right now. Well, I'm very happy to say that I have a very esteemed guest on today's episode to talk to us about many aspects of the complex and often misunderstood cuisine. And so off I went, one rainy and cold January afternoon, to the British Library to talk about some aspects of the long history of Indian food. Today's episode will be a short introduction to the world of Indian cooking, and I hope in the near future to explore a lot more in depth and detail the fragrant, sweet and savoury character of the food from ancient times till the modern age of spice trade with the English, Portuguese and Dutch. So let's welcome on this episode the author of The Philosophy of Curry, Sejal Sukhadwala. Well, Sejal, welcome to the Delicious Legacy podcast.
Thank you.
So,
it's nice to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, your culinary adventures and your past, and about your book.
Right. Yeah, I've been writing about food for more than 20 years. For me, it's a second profession because I used to work in the mental health profession with various mental health charities, and that's because I did a degree in psychology. So I kind of fell into that line of work, but it didn't really work out for me. I didn't enjoy it, so I switched professions about 20 years ago and I started writing about food. And I mainly write for UK-based publications like newspapers, magazines, websites, but I do write occasionally for American and Indian publications as well. I write mainly about either food history, especially Indian food history or British food history, or London restaurants. And sometimes I write about different vegetarian cuisines from around the world, being a vegetarian myself. So it's quite a broad sort of remit. And the book came about because the British Library got in touch with me out of the blue about 2 years ago, and they asked me to write a book as part of the philosophy series, which includes other titles as well. Like there are books on the philosophy of tea, coffee, gin, whiskey, beer, wine, and so on. And they asked me if I want to write about the philosophy of curry. And at first I thought, well, just because I'm Indian, they're stereotyping me. And at first I was thinking, well, no, because why should I write about curry just because I'm Indian? And then I realized that, they needed someone to write about curry, and they were actually making an effort to find an Indian origin writer. And I was really impressed by that. And although, my knowledge was quite broad-ranging, I didn't have in-depth knowledge about the topic, so I had to research. And eventually I said yes. And I really, really enjoyed working on the book. The British Library have been really fabulous to work with. I had a brilliant editor. And, for my first book, I couldn't have asked for anything better. It was a really, really good experience. I really enjoyed writing it. And I hope people enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. I thought it was a marvellous book. And,
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I read it twice now.
Oh, wow, really? Oh, my God. That's really good.
Yeah, and to tell to our listeners, we are in the British Library now doing this interview.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, it's an amazing environment.
So inspiring.
It's lovely. Yeah, exactly. It's really inspiring. It's centrally located. You get people from all around the world, coming here, and it's just a really nice place to be in, I think. And home away from home. I was thinking as I was walking in.
Great. So, Sejal, we on the Delicious Legacy podcast now, we are exploring all these different ancient cuisines, and so far we haven't explored the Indian cuisine. So today I would like to touch a little bit about the history of Indian food, the culture and all that stuff that so many of us here in the West, we don't know about. We just have a generic term about your food, and that's all we know. Yeah. So you, as the author of The Philosophy of Curry, which is an excellent and informative book, as
Thank
we
you.
said.
Yeah.
I want to explain a little bit more about the Indian food, because we just use the word curry, and yet that's a very generic, catch-all term, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's like a shorthand for, instead of using the term Indian food or Indian cuisine, people just say curry. That's supposed to mean Indian food. It's so synonymous with Indian food. There are two problems with that. Firstly, it reduces Indian cuisine to this, one term, and there's a lot more to Indian food. There's rice and dal, which are really like rice, dal, and roti. They're the three kind of most important things for Indian people. There are different sabzis, which is side vegetable dishes, and of course, there's curries, there's pickles, pancakes, there's even noodles. There's lots of mithai, which is sweets, and there's lots and lots of different snacks and street foods. There's pancakes, there's all kinds of different things, and it's just reduced to this one term, curry. But the other thing as well is that curries can be found in different countries around the world as well. And there are people who've read my book and they've said, oh, I just thought it was going to be about Indian curries. And I was really surprised when you started talking about international curries. So, you can find curries in other parts of the world as well. And it's not just to do with Indian food.
Absolutely.
And actually, they're really popular in other countries. Especially, I've had so many readers writing to me from Japan. In Japan, curries are really popular, and Japanese readers have really taken to the book.
Wow.
Yeah, I was really surprised, and I was really flattered actually.
Yeah.
I just love all things Japanese, so I was really pleased about that.
Great, fantastic. So, to kickstart our exploration of Indian cuisine, maybe could you touch a little bit about the origin of the word curry? Because I know, obviously, it can be a very misleading term, but where did that word we use here in the West came from?
Yeah, there are all kinds of mythical ideas about, what the roots of the word is. Like someone said to me that they think, it comes from the name of a British colonial called Mr. Curry, and he loved Indian food, and, and why should we name our dish after him, and, that kind of thing. But actually it comes from Tamil word curry, and that word means different things. It means the colour black. It also means pepper, like black pepper, which was used and actually still is used quite extensively in South Indian cooking. And any dishes in ancient South India, any dish with black pepper was prefixed with the word curry, or curry rather, it's pronounced curry. And the Portuguese took that word and then they used it to apply it to a range of Indian dishes with gravy. So there were like sambars and rasam, which are like broth-like dishes, either thin broth or thick broth, made with lentils or legumes and spices. And because they're eaten with rice, they just use its catch-all term curry. So that's how the word came about. But it does have Indian origin. But it was used by the Portuguese as this kind of category of dishes. Basically, any kind of legumes or vegetables or meat or fish or chicken or paneer cooked in a gravy with spices. So they use that term for, to mean, dishes cooked in gravy. And, basically it just means, either the colour black or black pepper.
How interesting.
Traditionally, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So obviously, we mentioned that India is a huge country.
Yeah.
It's absolutely massive and big population as well. And if we include Nepal and Bangladesh and Pakistan, all this Indian subcontinent, we have a massive area. So not everybody eats the same thing. And
no,
there's
that's right.
so many different cuisines, completely different from each other. So yeah, the word curry, even if it was an Indian food per se, it would be very redundant. They can't describe all the sorts of things that are happening across this huge area, this vast area.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, because there are so many words for curry or curry-like dishes in India. Depending on which region you're from. So, like I'm Gujarati, and we call curries, we call them shak. Mm-hmm. If you're Punjabi, you'd call them sabzi. Now, dal is not, personally, I think it's a different category, so it's not curry. Then there's another dish made with yogurt as a base, and that's called kadhi. So firstly, there are curry-like words in different Indian languages, like kura, tarkari, there's upkari, and they all kind of basically mean curry. But there are also different words like I said, shak and sabzi. There's also salan, which is used in Hyderabad, and basically that means curry. There's thoran in South India, which also means a curry. So there are all these different words used, for specific dishes in different regions of India and in Bangladesh, as you said, and in Pakistan as well. But curry is a generic term which has been used. But in India, I would say, that curry is used for North Indian style restaurant curries. Because historically, North India is where the restaurants, as we know them now, originated. So North Indian dishes cooked in a gravy are called curries. And also the other word which is used instead of curry in India quite a lot is masala. So
Okay.
instead of saying chickpea curry, you would say chickpea masala. Instead of okra curry, it would be okra masala, and so on. But people, in India, they do use the word curry. I mean, it comes from Anglo-Indian times.
Of course.
And it is still used by many Indians, but not all Indians. And there are some Indian people who've said to me, we didn't use that word when I was growing up, so I don't even know what it means.
Incidentally, you said the Punjabi use the word sabzi.
Sabzi, yeah, that's right.
Is it Persian origin that does have any Persian?
No, yeah, because I know in Persian language, sabzi means, I think, vegetables.
Ah, right. Okay.
Or I've seen that word being used in Persian cookbooks and restaurant menus. I'm not sure, actually. I mean, it could be, from Mughlai times.
Yeah, could be. Yeah,
it's possible.
Because there is an influence in...
Yeah, definitely. In North Indian cooking, there's a Persian influence in Mughlai cooking and North Indian cooking generally.
Yeah, maybe you can tell us a bit about that, if you
Sure. Well, the first Mughal emperor who invaded India in 16th century, Babur, his name was Babur, and he started introducing lots of Persian influences from Persian kitchen. So, for instance, marinating meat in yogurt before cooking it in order to tenderize it, then mincing meat, because to make it soft and tender.
Yeah.
So keema comes from, that's a Persian influence. Then using fruit in curries, so fruit and spices, using that sweet and spicy mix of flavors.
Right.
That's a Persian influence.
Oh, wow, okay.
Using ground almonds or even almonds, almond flakes or almonds in curries, that's a Persian influence.
To thicken the sauces and stuff.
Yeah, in sauces, yeah. So that's a Persian influence as well. So there are, and like using fragrant things like rose petals or rose water, again, that's a Persian influence. So lots of curries, for instance, restaurant curries that we know in Britain, they have Persian origins initially. Lakoma, that's Persian origin curry, and pasanda, and so there are quite a few different curries which have Persian origin, and then they were adapted by North Indians. And what happened was the Persian influence came from Mughal emperors, and then Indian cooks added, Indian spices or Indian flavorings. So Indian spices, tamarind, coconut, cashew nuts, and so on. Then the two influences kind of merged, and then Mughlai cuisine was born.
In the 16th century, did you say?
Yeah, around 16th century. But it became more kind of refined, I would say, in the 17th century. But it's the earliest Mughlai cuisine was, 16th century.
Brilliant. Thanks. So if we go back in time, if we try and trace some early origins of Indian food and Indian dishes, and what do you have any evidence, either written or archaeological, of what did the early Indian people, what were the staple foods basically of people, and if there's any recipes surviving from thousands of years ago?
Yeah. I mean, there are so many, first of all, curry recipes mentioned in Mahabharata and ancient scriptures. And there's lots of archaeological evidence and evidence in old scriptures. Ancient Indian books mention food quite a lot. And there are lots of travelers' books as well, books written by travelers from Greece and from China and from Europe, which mention ancient Indian food as well. But there's plenty of evidence of what was eaten in ancient India. And firstly, there was a lot of meat eaten, and the whole animal was eaten. So nose to tail eating was quite common. There was lots of vegetables like aubergines and tubers, not potatoes, but tubers like yams and colocasia. And there were gourds, lots of different types of gourds and squashes were used quite a lot. There were legumes and rice, and not so much wheat, but I would say barley and millet were eaten quite a lot. Lots of gruel, like barley and millet were combined with either water or yogurt or milk, and they were eaten like porridge, either sweet or savoury. Lots of spices and herbs, such as, for instance, black pepper. Black pepper, long pepper, cubeb pepper, fresh and dried ginger, mustard. I mean, before the arrival of chilies in the 16th century, there was heat was achieved by a combination of fresh and dried ginger, mustard, and different types of peppercorns, black pepper and white pepper, Java pepper, long pepper. These were used to achieve heat. And then chilies were introduced in the 16th century, and
kind of substituted the peppers in a way for the spiciness.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially in South India, Indians were used to hot dishes, but the heat came from peppercorns. So South Indians were the first to embrace chilies very enthusiastically, and then it spread to the rest of India.
Right.
But chilies, we associate chilies with Indian food. They're so synonymous with Indian food, but they're not traditional. I mean, they only came as recently as the 16th century. So it's really hard to imagine Indian food, what it was like before. But it was still hot.
Of course.
It was kind of more balanced in terms of, there were other spices used as well, like nutmeg, there was cardamom, there was Indian cassia, which is leaves of cinnamon tree.
Right. How do they taste?
They taste similar to bay leaves.
Right.
They taste between cinnamon and bay leaves. It's
Right,
that kind
okay.
of, yeah,
So
they're quite fragrant,
Yeah,
quite
fragrant.
strong.
Yeah, okay. Nice.
Cloves and cinnamon, I think, came from Indonesia. They came to India quite early, so they were used in early Indian recipes and Mughlai recipes as well.
Of course.
But there are lots of spices used and herbs, including holy basil. There was lots of garlic. I think onions came mostly with Mughals. They started using onions quite enthusiastically, and so they came with Mughlai cooking. And before tomatoes were introduced in the 18th century, sour flavors were achieved with the use of tamarind, lemon juice, pomegranate juice,
Of course.
raw green mangoes, and dried raw green mangoes, and dried raw green mango powder as well.
Right, okay.
So these were used, as souring agents, and then tomatoes were introduced initially for the use of like the British in India, and then they started being embraced by Bengalis, and then the rest of India. And potatoes were new as well. They were introduced by either the British or the Dutch in 18th century. But before that, there was a prolific use of tubers like colocasia and purple yam and elephant yam, and all these different kinds of yams, which are still widely used in Indian cooking today.
Of course.
So initially, Indians were really skeptical of potatoes because according to Ayurveda, because so much Indian food is like, I would say, traditional Indian food was kind of dictated by Ayurvedic principles. So Ayurveda was skeptical about potatoes, believing them to cause indigestion. Then they started becoming very popular. But I would say, that ancient Indian food was, like I said, it was determined by Ayurvedic principles of what's hot and cold foods are, so what's good for your body.
Right.
Like, for instance, if you cooked with beans, in order to like prevent wind, you'd cook your beans with asafoetida. So that's still,
The
a
way
trick which is used today. So there are different things, different ways you'd kind of combine foods to make sure that they were good for your body. And also things like, like in winter, there's a whole genre of cooking, which is, winter warmer food, which is, nourishing food, which keep your body warm during winter months. Then apart from Ayurveda, there's also principles of like rasa and 6 flavors. So there's sweet, sour, hot, pungent, astringent, and bitter.
Right.
So these are the 6 flavors, which are used in Indian food. So they're all, and also, there were kind of elaborate doctrines on things like, pure and impure foods, and raw and cooked foods. But by raw and cooked foods, it just meant that if a food was considered to be cooked, it should contain water and ghee and milk. Otherwise, it would be raw. It was considered to be raw.
Okay.
Yeah. So, So there are all these kind of different ancient principles and.
Yeah, you paint a very extensive and complicated picture of rules and ways of cooking and methods. And really complex basically.
Yeah, but it was a very complex and sophisticated cuisine, and I think it's one of the ancient cuisines because so many cuisines are like rooted in like modern techniques, but I think this is one of the most ancient and sophisticated cuisines.
And of course, until today, the Indian cooks, the way they mix the spices, although we know about the peppers and the ginger and all that stuff since ancient times, so it was huge trade with the Mediterranean, with ancient Greeks and Romans. They used to import tons and tons of black pepper and long pepper.
Yeah, that's right.
And other spices from India. But I think we don't use them so wisely as the Indians to the full extent.
Yeah, no, I think it takes lots of practice, and I think if you're brought up with with the food. I think it takes what we call in India, a good hand to kind of understand, the mixing of spices. And I think it's a kind of ancient art, really, and I think it's something you learn and something you develop the more you cook the food.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that, when Anglo-Indians, when the British came to India, they found the cuisine really complex.
Right.
And it was too complex for the taste, and it was too complex in terms of cooking. So they simplified the recipes and they simplified the spicing, and they ended up inventing curry powder. So curry powder comes from British cook having invented, because they thought, grinding and roasting and mixing individual spices was just too complicated, and the spices were too pungent for the taste. So they just used, a few kind of, just random, because, there's no such thing as authentic curry powder. I mean, it's just a random mix of spices. Really.
Yeah.
And they must have, I'm sure, they must have kind of mixed and matched according to their taste and arrived at recipes that worked for them, but there's no such thing as like traditional curry powder. I mean, personally, I think it's completely random mix, and anything goes.
Great.
And actually, I read an article about curry powder and garam masala, and someone was saying, what's stopping someone from calling mulled wine spices curry powder, garam masala, because it's basically just mixed with like Indian spices, really.
Cinnamon, clove.
So it's basically a garam masala wine you're drinking, or curry powder wine you're drinking.
Yeah.
So I mean, these recipes were simplified, but it is very complex. But I don't want to make it sound like it's anything mystical that people can't achieve. I mean, if you cook Indian food regularly, and if you kind of get to a stage where you start mixing the spices according to your taste.
But the balance of spices, you can achieve that by cooking every day, and of course having good spices, fresh spices, right? That's another secret which...
That's right, yeah. I think, you need to use really good quality spices sourced from, good spice merchants. Don't keep them in your cupboards for too long. Use them while they're still fresh, because otherwise spices can go rancid.
Right.
There are oils and spices which can go rancid, and then you'll really notice the difference if you use old spices and new freshly brought spices. And also use them judiciously, because I find the use in, like, if someone who's non-Indian is doing Indian recipes, for instance, I find the use of spices really kind of random. Like you'd get pulao rice with 2 tablespoons of turmeric, which no Indian cook would pulao rice with 2 tablespoons of turmeric. That's a lot. Yeah. So just things like that, and I don't know, you just need to be a bit more careful with the use of spices. You don't need to put loads of spices in. But that's the other thing, lots of Indian food, I find, modern Indian food or contemporary Indian food, even home-cooked food, is getting very masala-fied. So there's, more and more, spices are being used more and more randomly. And in India, in 20th century, there was less use of spices. There was a more kind of nuanced use of spices. And I just think, everything is becoming overspiced in a way.
Yeah.
And there were more kind of nuanced and more subtle flavors. So Indian food doesn't have to be all spicy.
Yeah. Some
of the dishes are quite mild, or they're quite subtly spiced. Whereas what you get these days in restaurants and actually even home cooking is just this indiscriminate use of spices, and it's just like one-dimensional. And that really worries me, because I think, real Indian food, or how it was cooked, even like I would say 20 years ago, it was just a lot more nuanced, a lot more three-dimensional. So I'm a bit worried about overuse of spices, actually. But I love spices, so especially in, I think in snacks, they work really well, street foods.
Yeah. Today's episode is brought to you with the welcome support of Malbin Greek, UK's leading Greek delicatessen supplier and distributor of premium Greek produce. Whatever your needs, Malbin Greek has you covered. You can shop online and have the divine and delicious goods delivered to your doorstep across the UK, or you can visit the shop at Arch 17 Apollo Business Park, Lucy Way, SC16 4ET, Bermondsey, London. Malbin Greek, the one-stop shop for your Greek fix. Moving on through the ages and the centuries, and we touched about the Mongols and that. So after that, we have the first wave of colonialism. So North Europeans coming in contact with the Indian subcontinent. We have Portuguese and we have Dutch, and English. Who were the first that started the whole spice trade and
Yeah, it was the Portuguese who came to India first, in 15th century. Well, they came looking for pepper and spices, and they established the earliest colonies. That was Vasco da Gama, and then he went back to Portugal, and then he came back, with his crew. So Portuguese were the first colonials, and then the British found a direct route, and then the British came and the Dutch came, and the Dutch didn't come to India, but the British and the Dutch also found direct routes to the spice trade, but the Portuguese were the first.
Did they leave some mark on the food, the Portuguese, in the Indian food?
Yeah, they did in Goa. Actually, they established colony in eastern India as well. In Goa, vindaloo comes from Portuguese pork preserved in wine and wine vinegar, and it was preserved in barrels by Portuguese sailors.
Yeah.
So, and it had garlic in it for preservative. So that's the origin of vindaloo. Oh, and then they added spices, like peppercorns and cumin and coriander and so on. And then when chilies were introduced to India in 16th century, Portuguese loved the chilies. So they got, I think, a little bit carried away and added lots of chilies. So vindaloo became a very hot curry.
Right.
And it also had tamarind and so on added by local, Goans adapted it. So vindaloo is a very famous example of Portuguese influence on Goan cooking. But lots of Goan cooking is influenced by Goan Christian cooking is influenced by Portuguese cooking, like lots of seafood curries and cakes. There are lots of cakes, and there are breads. Portuguese introduced bread as well to that part of India, and then they set up bakeries. And the British introduced bread to the rest of India as well. Then the Portuguese also in eastern India, they introduced, it's said, there are various theories around Indian, should I say Bengali mithai. And Bengali mithai is based on what's called chena, which is the loose curds of paneer. Paneer is an Indian cheese, which is made by, curdling milk. And you just, once you drain off the whey, you're left with loose, milk curds. And that's used for making mithai. And mithai in Bengali is called mishti. So the mishti is often made from paneer, and it is said that the technique of curdling milk, which had been taboo in India since the Aryan times, since the Indus Valley civilization, because cows are really highly revered. So if cows produce milk, you're not supposed to break the milk or destroy the milk by curdling it, by adding any acid to it. So that was taboo for many centuries. Then the Portuguese came along and introduced this technique of breaking the milk by adding acid, like lemon juice or something, or vinegar or something, and then you end up with this, milk curds. It's controversial. Some people say that actually in ancient Indian scriptures there are milk curds mentioned, so it's not the Portuguese, but then there are the other people who insist that Portuguese introduced, or rather maybe reintroduced that technique of making milk curds, and then they started being used in Bengali cooking, but especially in mithai, in mishti making. And Bengali sweets are really, really famous. Bengali sweets are to India what fine French patisserie is to Europe, basically.
Nice.
Yeah. So the Portuguese had a huge influence and actually, I think a little understood or underrated influence. I think everyone knows about, not everyone, but many people know about, the influence on Goan food, on the origins of vindaloo, but not many people know that actually they influenced mithai making or mishti making in Bengal as well.
Brilliant. That's interesting,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think all colonials, the British had a huge influence as well on Indian cooking. So lots of chops and sandwiches, and even some curries like railway curry and something called country captain. These all have, Anglo-Indian, British origins. And even, there's this kind of idea that Mughlai curries, or actually if you go to India, there's this generic mix of vegetables used, which is like potatoes, carrots, peas, green beans, and cauliflower. And these are called, mixed vegetables, which you find in frozen sections in supermarkets. But, these mixed vegetables are just really commonplace in Indian curries, in Indian pilaus. in all kinds of different dishes. And where did that combination of vegetables come from? Because it's not Indian.
It's not Indian.
But it's British. It's because the British didn't like Indian vegetables, which is all sort of aubergines and gourds and okra and, that kind of thing. So then they started growing their own vegetables in presidency towns. And it was these vegetables, really. And so they left this, which were, eventually they were embraced by Indian people. And they've left this, one of the lasting legacies of the British is actually this mix of vegetables. So let's take, I'll give you a really good example, which is pav bhaji. Now, pav bhaji is a street food, which you often get in Indian restaurants as well. And basically what it is mixed vegetables, which are, like I said, potatoes, cauliflower, carrots, green beans and peas. They all cook together and they're all kind of coarsely mashed. And then they're cooked with tomatoes and onions and lots of different spices. So it's a really lovely, hot, pungent, absolutely delicious dish cooked with lots of butter. And it's eaten with bread which has been sauteed in butter. So it's quite rich and it's quite fattening, but it's so delicious and it's hugely, hugely popular in Bombay and in other parts of India as a street food. But if you look at the influence, the bread, it was British influence. It was introduced by the British, and the vegetables were grown by the British. So actually, the origins of this iconic dish in India is British.
Probably British,
yeah. And the tomatoes and chilies and everything, they were introduced by British as well. So this is the thing I have, when people ask me about authenticity or about authentic Indian food, I don't believe in food authenticity because, you have to, it's like how far back do you go? I could tell you what's authentic pav bhaji, the dish I just mentioned, which is, the way I described it, that's the authentic way of cooking it. And if you added truffle oil or blue cheese in it, it's not authentic. But then again, what is authentic? Because, that dish came from all this British influence or British ingredients.
Yeah.
And, before 16th century, this dish didn't exist. So it's like, how far back do you go?
400 years is already old enough in a way.
Yeah.
Okay. As we said, we can go back 2,000 years and find something else. But then things evolve all the time.
No, exactly, yeah.
People migrate.
And so, this idea of authentic Indian food is problematic, I think.
I think, everybody does that. It's not, I think, Italians and Greeks and French, they have the same.
Exactly.
They want to safeguard their cuisine.
Yeah.
It's like, just let it be.
Yeah.
People will eat what they need to eat.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I think, I don't know, there's a thin line between innovation and bastardization. So, but then, who decides and...
Absolutely. Who decides that?
Taste?
Yeah.
Who tastes? Who decides? To me, that tastes horrible, but then someone else might like it.
Yeah. I suppose if it's a top-down, like dictated from someone from above to the people, you have to eat this, or the other way around, if people normal people, the masses, everyday people cook it and they like it and part of their everyday experience, then it's authentic, I suppose, rather than if someone says, you shouldn't do this or do this.
No, that's right. Yeah.
So I suppose the next stage in the history of the Indian food at curry is the introduction to Britain, right?
Britain and other countries around the world as well. In other countries, it was either introduced by Indian indentured labourers who went to work in other countries, or it was introduced by the British because they took along curry powders and curry recipe books and just, actual curries. In Britain, they came initially through the returned Indian nabobs. Nabobs is a British word for nawabs, which is basically a term for district superintendent in India. And these Anglo-Indians had worked for the East India Company. They came back to Britain in the 19th century and they brought back recipes from their cooks in India and some cookery books which were either written by Indians, but mostly they were written by non-Indians, by the British or by Anglo-Indian authors. They brought back curry powders and they basically wanted to continue eating curries here like they were used to doing in India. The early curries came from the returnees of, of East India Company. And also, curries were eaten in the army as well. So, army officers were used to eating them. And they were popular actually even, in the time, like during the time of Queen Victoria as well, because she was really fond of curries.
Right.
So because of the empire, they were popular in Britain, or they went in and out of fashion in Britain among the British as well as the British in India. So they were popular then, but I think really the earliest curries were found through what we now call pop-ups, which took place in areas like, Wembley, where they had like what they call empire exhibitions.
Right.
Now the empire exhibitions were like themed around India, and they had entertainment, they had like pavilions, which were made in the image of like the Taj Mahal, or, they had snake charmers, they had jugglers, they kind of made India into some kind of theme park. And they had Indian food pop-ups, and they brought over cooks from India to cook curries, and they became very popular with the British. So those were the earliest curries. And then someone called Sheikh Deen Mohammed, he opened London's first Indian restaurant in 1810.
Right.
So early 19th century. That was the first Indian restaurant. And that was in Marylebone. And it lasted for about a year, and it was decorated in this Raj theme, with kind of wicker furniture and potted palms, and a shisha room for smoking shisha pipes. And he had this menu full of like curries which were eaten by Anglo-Indians in India at the time. So there was korma, and there was vindaloo, and all this kind of stuff. That was the menu at the time.
How do we know all this information? Is from reviews from newspapers of the time, or how?
I know this because there was London's first restaurant guide was called Regency Restaurant Guide or something. It was actually reprinted by the British Library in 2012, and I actually have a copy at home. And
nice.
And it's really interesting because it has restaurant reviews of restaurants which were around at the time, and the only Indian restaurant is this restaurant, and it was called Hindustani Coffee House. And there's a short review of what was on the menu, what the food was like, what the decor was like. Also, there was a menu which was auctioned in 2018, the original menu of Hindustani Coffee House, and it was sold, I think, for £8,500.
Wow.
Yeah, I would have done anything to get hold of that menu. If I could have afforded to buy it, I would have bought it actually, because I think just imagine what an interesting historical piece of document. But that had curries like korma and vindaloo and madras and so on. So the second prominent Indian restaurant was Viraswami's, which is still around at the moment, but it only has two original items from the menu. I mean, it's changed. It's kind of like a modern Indian restaurant now, but it's the oldest surviving Indian restaurant in London. But there were lots of other restaurants before them in early 20th century, which was set up by Bangladeshi sailors.
Right, of course.
And they came from this region called Sylhet in what is now Bangladesh, but at the time it was part of Bengal, because Bengal became, Bengal, Pakistan and India, they were all one country. And then after the partition, there was, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then Bangladesh became, separate in 1971. They were all, part of the same country, so they have the same history, and the food has similarities, but there are differences as well. And anyway, so these sailors came from part of Bengal called Sylhet, the Sylhet region in eastern India.
Yep.
And they worked on British steamships in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And the conditions of working in the steamships were terrible. I mean, they worked in boiler rooms, and the boilers exploded, and they were poorly paid. They were really badly treated. There was lots of racism. So, these poor guys, I mean, they were hardworking, Bengali, strong, Bengali men, hardworking, but they didn't speak English because that region is quite poor, so they weren't educated. So they started traveling to places like, London, Southampton, Singapore, New York. And whenever they got the opportunity, they would just jump ship, they would just disembark, and then they would settle in those areas. And they didn't want to go back because, they didn't want to, face that journey back. It's a perilous journey.
It's either you are in a steamship working in the boiler room, or you go back home in poverty, and both options were terrible.
But so many people died as well. So many of the seamen died. So, they didn't want to risk losing their lives. unfortunately, when they got off in London or Singapore or wherever, the conditions were bad because, they didn't have any money, they didn't have education, they didn't have jobs. So initially they started by either, begging or stealing or sweeping churchyards or selling things like, curry powder or coffee or chocolate or something in pubs.
Yeah.
Then some of the earliest ones got jobs working as dishwashers in hotels and restaurants, so that was their entry point in catering. Of course, they missed home cooking, so they started cooking for themselves, really. Many of them lived in East London in boarding houses, and the conditions in boarding houses were really bad as well initially. But there was a guy called Mr. Ali in early 20th century, and there were all these Bangladeshi seamen who lived in the area, and of course, they were working and they needed to eat. So Mr. Ali set up a cafe, and he started serving them rice and curry. He cooked rice and curry and started serving them to these Bangladeshi sailors, and that must have been the first Bangladeshi restaurant. And initially they were just catering for the community. Yeah. Then other people started copying the idea and started setting up this coffee houses which sold curry and rice to each other. Then someone opened the first one in central London, not just for Bangladeshi sailors but just for the general British public. So they then started opening in central London and eventually in places like Southall, in West London as well. And the early ones catered to British customers, but also to Indian students, because Indian students, there were Indian students here, they miss the taste of home. And there were kind of Indian students as well, saw a gap in the market. And after their studies were finished, they set up restaurants in central London as well. Yeah, so there were all these kind of Bangladeshi and Indian restaurants, popping up in East London and in central London. And they started getting British customers who were initially very skeptical. They were not familiar with the food. They found chilies too hot. They found spices too pungent. They didn't like coriander. They didn't like garlic. So, and these young British men were not. The older British men, the Nabobs, they were used to Indian food in India. The younger British men, they weren't used to it. So, the Bangladeshi seamen started diluting, if you like, the food. And also using shortcuts because you were cooking for so many people, every day. So you can't really use long cooking methods which are used in traditional Indian cooking, like slow cooking or layering spices or, cooking onions for like 10, 15 minutes or whatever, You had to use like shortcuts. So they started using all those techniques. And the British customers didn't appreciate, whether you gave them like traditional food or not. So, so that kind of became the norm, if you like. And they started eventually using ready-made masalas and curry pastes and curry sauces. And after initial skepticism, the British started liking Indian food or Bangladeshi Indian food. And the other thing which happened was, after the Second World War, the Bangladeshi seamen started buying up derelict fish and chip shops. And they started serving curry and rice with fish and chips and with pies and sausages and, like British menu. And the rice and curry were just like side note, they weren't really part of the main menu. So just out of curiosity, the British started using curry as a sauce to go with the chips.
Yes.
And they started liking it, and then they started eating it with rice. So, and then it became popular. So rice and curry became popular in its own right. And then eventually it became so popular that, the Bangladeshi restaurant owners, they felt confident enough to discontinue fish and chips and pies and everything, and then they just made all Indian menus. They introduced all Indian menus, and then they eventually started serving the post-pub trade. So, late at night, there would be all these young men who'd just be leaving pubs and looking for something to eat.
Yeah.
And Indian restaurants were open, and then that's how Indian food became associated with drinking. Also in Veeraswamy, it is said that Carlsberg was really popular with the Dutch king, and he sent a crate of Carlsberg to Veeraswamy in the early 20th century, and they served it to the customers. So the customers really liked the pairing of Carlsberg lager and curry, and then they started asking for more. So they started this trend of drinking lager with curry. So there are all kinds of different theories as to how the pairing of curry and lager came about. But someone was asking me about this the other day, that how why do people end up drinking lager with curry? Because it's not necessarily the best drink. I mean, it's lager is full of gas, and And actually in India, you'd have, you've got like people of my dad's generation or uncle's generations drinking spirits, like whiskey and rum are more popular. And even, I think Swedish wine, like gewurz, I think it goes more with Indian food, with spicy food. But there's this tradition of drinking, especially in Britain, lager with curry, so we're stuck with it, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah, brilliant.
But one thing, sorry, if I just go back to what we were talking about before, one thing I forgot to mention was the food we eat in restaurants here is a Bangladeshi interpretation of Anglo-Indian food, which was served in Indian restaurants in India at the time.
Wow.
In North India at the time. So, because South Indian restaurants have a different history, because it started with feeding pilgrims in temples. So South Indian restaurants have a different history. In Western and Eastern India, people were more conservative in the old days. When I talk about old days, I'm talking about early 20th century. So home cooking was valued, and you didn't really eat out. And actually they had something called, what we would now call supper clubs. So you'd have, women running supper clubs, and you'd go to their houses to eat. But North India has a different history because of, it's to do with the Grand Trunk Road and the trade on the Grand Trunk Road.
Yeah.
So the earliest restaurants opened in North India to serve truck drivers who were traveling around the Grand Trunk Road and the traders who were traveling. So yeah, it has a strange history because, a lot of, that food has kind of Mughlai influenced. It was interpreted by kind of Punjabi immigrants. And then Punjabi immigrants, when they opened the first Indian restaurants in North India, they catered to the taste of Anglo-Indians who were, the rich paying customers. So then that food kind of associated with restaurant cooking in India at the time. So that is what the earliest Bangladeshi restaurateurs interpreted as, Indian food to serve to customers in Britain.
Yeah.
So in a way, the food we're eating is Mughlai, Punjabi, Anglo-Indian, Bangladeshi food.
Yeah.
Which is, it's but I suppose we're eating a taste of history. It's a taste of history.
That's a good way to think of it. Yeah. Definitely, I like that.
Yeah. And lots of Indian people would say, but it's not real Indian food, or it's not how we make it at home. But then I think lots of Indian people as well, they grew up eating this kind of food in Britain. Lots of diaspora Indians, and I think it should be considered to be a cuisine in its own right. It's in India they might consider it to be foreign food, or like British Indian food, but it's a cuisine in its own right. You can't compare it to Indian home cooking in India or Indian home cooking even here. I think it's just a different genre altogether, and I think that's a good way of appreciating it.
Absolutely.
I think.
Brilliant. And I think that's a nice way to end up that short trip in Indian culinary history, I suppose.
It's quite a trip.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this introduction, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot more about the Indian cuisine and the story behind it.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
It's good to talk to you.
Great. And your book is The Philosophy of Curry?
Yeah.
Out by the British Library. And you can find it everywhere, I suppose.
Yeah, it's available everywhere. You can buy it from the British Library shop, or you can buy it online. And I think it's available actually all over the world now.
Great.
Which is really good, yeah.
Like curry.
Exactly, yeah. Like curry, the book is available everywhere. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And this is it, a short introduction to the history of Indian food. I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Sejal, learned a few tips and techniques on the philosophy of Indian food. And of course, I hope we dispelled some popular myths about curry and Indian cuisine and made you hungry for some spicy or not so spicy food. Thank you. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy podcast. Remember, I'm on Twitter as The Delicious Legacy, or on Instagram, or you'll find me on YouTube as well with videos about ancient recipes. Plus, the podcast is on Spotify, Apple Pods, Google Pods, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, Amazon, and so on. So help me by leaving some reviews and rate the podcast. And of course, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, or if you have any subjects that you want me to cover, again, just pop me a line. And of course, don't forget, if you want exclusive content, such as the whole interview with Sejal about the history of Indian food, come and join me on Patreon from $3 a month.